county hearing room was already laughing when Martha Hale unfolded the photographs. Not everyone. Just enough people. Enough to make it clear what they thought of her. The Cannery's attorney sat with a neat stack of reports. The operations manager sat beside him. 3 county officials occupied the front row, and Martha, a 68-year-old widow with dirt still under her fingernails from the morning harvest, stood alone at the podium. "Mrs. Hale," the chairman said, trying to sound patient, "the issue before us is whether the waste disposal practices caused damage to your property." Martha nodded. Then she slid the first photograph onto the projector. The room grew quiet. The image showed a patch of soil behind her fence. Not damaged, not poisoned, not ruined. The soil was black, rich black, the kind of soil most farmers spent decades trying to build. Then she placed a second photograph beside it, and a third, and a fourth. Each image raised the same question. If the cannery had been dumping waste behind her property for 12 years, why was her land becoming the most productive vegetable farm in the county? The attorney smiled. He thought the answer helped his case. The chairman seemed relieved. Several people began whispering. The hearing looked finished. Then Martha placed one final photograph onto the screen. Nobody recognized what they were looking at. A trench. An old drainage channel. Something buried beneath 12 years of tomato waste. That's when the room stopped feeling comfortable. Because Martha wasn't there to prove the cannery had harmed her farm. She was there to prove they had been hiding something. And before the hearing ended, half the county would wish they had listened much sooner. 12 years earlier, Martha Hale had inherited 27 acres after her husband passed away. Most people assumed she would sell. The land wasn't large enough for modern row crop farming. The equipment was old. The house needed repairs. The local bank privately estimated the property would change hands within 3 years. But Martha stayed. She didn't talk much, didn't attend every meeting, didn't complain. She simply worked. Neighbors noticed things. She kept notebooks, measured rainfall by hand, recorded soil temperatures, tracked drainage patterns after storms. When a section of field flooded, she didn't just pump water away. She tried to understand why it flooded. When crops struggled, she dug holes and studied the soil profile. She noticed details, the kind most people overlooked. About 2 years after her husband's death, the regional tomato cannery expanded operations. Truck traffic increased. Processing volume doubled. New waste ponds appeared. Most residents barely paid attention. Martha did, because the trucks sometimes used an access road running behind her property. At first, she assumed nothing unusual was happening. Then she noticed something strange. After heavy rains, a reddish material appeared near the rear drainage ditch. Not much, just enough to stand out. Pulp, seeds, organic waste, tomato residue. The cannery denied any improper disposal. The county found nothing. Life moved on, but the material kept appearing, year after year. Nobody noticed it. Except Martha. 6 years later, neighboring landowners began complaining. Not about Martha, about flooding. Fields that had drained properly for decades suddenly remained wet. Tile systems backed up. Planting schedules slipped. Crop yields fell. Nobody connected the problems. The county blamed rainfall patterns. Consultants blamed aging infrastructure. Farmers blamed bad luck. But Martha kept records, and her records didn't fit the official explanation. Something was changing underground, something gradual, something spreading. Then an excavator operator named Frank Dugan made an offhand comment while repairing a drainage line. "I've never seen that much organic buildup in a ditch." Martha looked up. "What kind of buildup?" Frank shrugged. "Looks almost like compost." That should have been impossible. The ditch wasn't supposed to contain compost. or anything close to it. Yet Frank wasn't the only person noticing strange conditions. A grain elevator manager reported unusual moisture issues across several nearby farms. A retired surveyor mentioned altered drainage flow. A neighboring farmer complained that water no longer followed historical patterns. Individually, none of the observations meant much. Together, they formed a contradiction. And contradictions always interested Martha. That's when she began digging deeper. The real problem wasn't flooding. The real problem was that nobody understood why the flooding was happening. Martha visited county archives. She requested drainage maps, survey records, historical engineering documents. Most people would have quit after the first day. The records stretched back decades. Some dated to the 1940s. Others were hand-drawn. Many appeared incomplete. Then someone found a document, an original watershed map. The map showed something unexpected. A forgotten drainage channel crossing behind multiple properties, including Martha's, including land near the Cannery. The channel had once carried seasonal runoff. Over time, it disappeared from modern records. Development projects ignored it. Infrastructure plans overlooked it. Yet there it was. The old path remained, buried, hidden, still influencing underground water movement. Martha copied everything. Then she visited county officials. Nobody seemed concerned. The drainage channel wasn't active anymore, at least officially. The warning went nowhere. 3 days later, another heavy storm hit. Several fields flooded again, and Martha noticed something nobody else did. Tomato seeds were sprouting inside the flood debris. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The warning had been there all along. If seeds were traveling through the drainage network, something else could be moving through it too. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Hollow Harvest. Because what Martha discovered next turned a local nuisance into a mystery, stretching back more than a decade. The first real clue arrived through a witness, Frank Dugan, the excavator operator. Frank had worked on drainage systems for nearly 30 years. One afternoon, he called Martha. "I found something." She drove over immediately. A repair trench exposed layers of material unlike normal soil. Organic deposits, compressed, layered, repeated, year after year. Frank pointed at the profile. "See those bands?" Martha nodded. They looked almost like tree rings, seasonal deposits, accumulating over time. The layers suggested one thing. The material wasn't arriving accidentally. It had been arriving consistently, for years, maybe more than a decade. But that wasn't the strange part. Embedded inside several layers were fragments of industrial filter fabric, the kind commonly used in processing facilities. Martha photographed everything. Then she began comparing dates. The timeline matched the cannery's expansion almost perfectly. Still, evidence wasn't proof. She needed something stronger, something documented. Then someone found a maintenance record. The record came from a retired employee. His name was Leonard Pierce, former maintenance supervisor. He had kept copies of old work logs, mostly out of habit. One entry caught Martha's attention. It referenced repeated drainage issues behind the facility, temporary overflow events, containment concerns, emergency pumping operations. The language was vague, almost intentionally vague. But the dates mattered. The overflow events coincided with years showing unusually large organic deposits. Leonard wasn't accusing anyone. He simply provided records. Yet the records raised a larger question. If waste had been escaping containment systems for years, why had no agency report reflected it? That's when things stopped making sense. Martha filed information requests. Some reports appeared missing. Others seemed incomplete. Sections referenced attachments that no longer existed. The paper trail had holes. and holes in records usually meant one of two things: negligence or concealment. Either possibility was serious, but neither explained the richest soil in the county. The hidden problem was becoming harder to ignore. By year 11, Martha's vegetable farm had become surprisingly successful. Restaurants bought directly from her. Local markets sold out regularly. Agricultural specialists visited to study her soil health practices. Everyone focused on the vegetables. Nobody focused on the mystery underneath them. Then retired surveyor Bill Ramsey entered the story. Witness number 3. Bill reviewed Martha's maps, examined elevation data, studied historical drainage routes, and found something alarming. The old channel didn't end behind her property. It connected multiple farms, multiple drainage systems, multiple watersheds. The audience thought this was a story about one fence line. It wasn't. The problem covered thousands of acres. And if the deposits had traveled farther than expected, nobody knew where they stopped. Then, Bill found an engineering report buried inside Archive County files. The report contradicted everything officials had been saying. According to the report, the old drainage corridor remained partially active underground, not abandoned, not irrelevant, active. The county had known decades earlier. Then the references vanished from newer plans. Why? Nobody could answer. And that question changed everything. Martha believed she finally understood the truth. The cannery's waste had migrated through forgotten drainage pathways. Case closed. Mystery solved. Except it wasn't. Because the engineering report contained a handwritten note. A note added years after the report's creation. Only 7 words. Channel diverted during industrial expansion project. No explanation, no details, no signatures, nothing. Martha began investigating the expansion project. The records revealed a shock. The drainage route hadn't merely been ignored. It had been altered. Deliberately. The old channel was redirected during construction decades earlier. And the diversion affected far more than the cannery. It influenced water movement across an entire agricultural district. Suddenly, the mystery grew larger. This wasn't one facility. This wasn't one farm. This wasn't one disposal issue. It was a regional drainage decision hidden beneath years of development, and nobody seemed eager to discuss it. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe to The Hollow Harvest, because from this point forward, every answer only made the mystery bigger. Nobody knew it then. But the aerial photograph was about to create the most dangerous moment in the entire investigation, because it looked like an answer. And answers make people stop looking. Within weeks, consultants produced new reports. County engineers reviewed drainage records. Officials held public meetings. Charts appeared. Maps appeared. Experts arrived carrying binders, thick enough to end arguments. The conclusion seemed obvious. The forgotten channel had redirected water. The redirected water had altered drainage patterns. The altered drainage patterns had contributed to years of flooding. Mystery solved. At least that's what everyone believed. Local newspapers treated it like a finished story. Residents moved on. The cannery's attorneys seemed relieved. Even some farmers accepted the explanation. For the first time in months, the pressure began to fade. But Martha couldn't shake a feeling. Something still didn't fit. One evening, she spread photographs across her kitchen table. Flood maps, yield records, soil reports, drainage diagrams. She stared at them for nearly 2 hours. Then she noticed the contradiction. It was so simple she almost missed it. The hidden channel explained water. It explained flooding. It explained drainage failures. But it didn't explain productivity. Not even close. If drainage alone created rich farmland, Dozens of neighboring properties should have experienced the same results. They hadn't. Some had improved slightly. Some had become worse. Some remained unchanged. Yet Martha's vegetable fields had become extraordinarily productive, far beyond what the drainage explanation could account for. The numbers weren't even close. She pulled out harvest records, tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, year after year. The yields kept increasing. Soil organic matter kept increasing. Water retention improved. Nutrient balance improved. The farm wasn't merely surviving, it was thriving. And the official explanation couldn't explain why. That's when things stopped making sense again. 3 days later, Martha visited someone she hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Harold Finch, retired soil conservation officer. 37 years with the district, the kind of man who could identify soil types from a handful of dirt. Harold listened quietly. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. "Have you tested below the top layer?" Martha frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everybody keeps testing what's near the surface." He pointed toward her reports. "What if the answer isn't there?" The next morning they dug. Not a shallow sample, a deep one, then another, then another. What they found changed everything. Several feet below the surface sat a layer of soil unlike anything Harold expected. Dark, dense, exceptionally rich, ancient floodplain material, the kind rarely found intact. Harold stared at the samples for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "This shouldn't be here." Martha felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "This layer belongs somewhere else." Suddenly, the investigation had a new mystery. Not where water was moving, but where soil had come from. And that question was far more dangerous, because soil doesn't relocate itself. Someone or something had moved it. The search led Martha back into county archives, back into storage rooms, back into records most people hadn't touched in decades. Weeks passed. Then someone found a permit. Not a drainage permit, not an environmental report, a construction permit, 31 years old, issued during the industrial expansion project. The permit referenced major excavation work, thousands of cubic yards, multiple contractors, temporary access corridors, material relocation. But something was missing: the attached maps. Every reference pointed to maps, yet the maps were gone. Not damaged, not misplaced, gone. That's when Martha realized the story wasn't getting smaller. It was getting bigger. Much bigger. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Hollow Harvest, because the missing maps Martha was searching for would uncover a truth nobody had considered. Not the county, not the engineers, and certainly not the cannery. For nearly 2 months, the maps remained missing. Then an unexpected witness appeared, a former equipment operator named Gene Rollins. Gene was 81 years old. He rarely attended public meetings, rarely spoke to reporters, but he remembered the expansion project, and more importantly, he remembered what happened before it. Gene sat at Martha's kitchen table one rainy afternoon. At first, his story seemed unrelated. Bulldozers, excavators, construction crews, temporary roads. Then he mentioned something strange: a borrow pit. Martha looked up. "A borrow pit?" Gene nodded. "They needed fill material." "Where?" Gene pointed toward a faded aerial photograph, not toward the cannery, not toward the industrial site, toward a low area near the old floodplain. An area later erased from modern maps. Gene leaned forward. "We dug a lot more than they planned." Martha felt her pulse quicken. "How much more?" Gene laughed softly. "Enough that people started asking questions." Then he said something nobody expected. "They told us the soil was worthless." He paused. "They were wrong." For the first time, pieces began aligning. The excavation, the missing maps, the unusual soil, the hidden channel, the productive fields. But one question remained. Where had all that excavated material gone? The answer would finally expose the deepest layer of the mystery. The breakthrough arrived from a place nobody expected. Not the county archives, not the engineering consultants, not the cannery. It came from an estate sale. A retired surveyor had passed away the previous winter. His family was clearing out decades of records. Most of the boxes contained routine material, property boundaries, fence disputes, road easements, nothing unusual. Then a local historian recognized a familiar project number. The same number Martha had seen on the missing construction permit. Within hours, she was driving across the county. The box looked ordinary, dusty, water-stained, forgotten. Inside sat dozens of rolled maps. Most were unrelated. Then she found it. The expansion project. Original excavation plans. Original grading plans. Original elevation surveys. And attached to them was something nobody had seen in over 30 years. A pre-construction soil assessment. Martha spread the pages across a table. For several minutes she simply stared. Then she called Harold. Then Bill. Then Jean. By evening, all four were studying the documents. Nobody spoke much. The maps were doing the talking. According to the original surveys, the area chosen for excavation wasn't random. It sat directly on top of an ancient floodplain deposit. Centuries of river sediment, layer upon layer of nutrient-rich soil. The kind of ground farmers dream about. The kind that almost never survives modern development intact. Harold ran his finger across one section, then another, then another. The deeper he read, the quieter he became. Finally, he leaned back. My God. Nobody asked what he meant. They already knew. The excavation project had removed enormous quantities of some of the most fertile soil in the region. Far more than planners originally intended. And according to the grading records, much of that material had been transported elsewhere during construction. The question was obvious. Where? The answer was buried in handwritten notes near the bottom of a survey sheet. Temporary spoil placement. South drainage corridor. Martha looked at Bill. Bill looked at Jean. Jean slowly nodded. The south drainage corridor. The same corridor connected to the forgotten channel. The same corridor that crossed behind Martha's property. The same corridor everyone had been investigating for months. That's when the final pieces clicked together. For years, people had believed the tomato waste created Martha's extraordinary soil. It made for a good story, an easy story, a story everyone could understand. But it wasn't true. The waste added organic material. That much was real. The drainage changes influenced moisture patterns. That was real too. But neither explained the scale of what happened. The true foundation of Martha's farm had been placed there decades earlier, hidden beneath the surface, waiting. The industrial excavation had unknowingly redistributed ancient floodplain soil along portions of the drainage corridor. Most of it remained buried, invisible. Then, over time, seasonal water movement slowly carried portions of that material across surrounding properties, including Martha's. The tomato waste hadn't created the miracle. It had merely drawn attention to it. For 12 years, everyone had been looking at the wrong layer. And once Martha realized that, another realization followed. The land itself had been trying to tell the story. The evidence had always been there. The unusual soil tests, the productivity differences, the inconsistent flooding, the contradictory results from neighboring farms. Every clue pointed toward the same conclusion. Nature had been writing the answer for decades. People simply weren't reading it. The public revelation came 3 weeks later. The hearing room filled long before the meeting began. Farmers packed the aisles. County officials occupied every available chair. Reporters lined the walls. Even the Cannery's legal team returned. Many expected another debate. Instead, they witnessed something else. Martha didn't arrive carrying accusations. She arrived carrying maps. One by one, she laid them out. The original floodplain survey, the excavation records, the grading plans, the soil assessments, the missing construction documents. Then she connected them. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just carefully, methodically. The room followed along. At first, people seemed confused, then intrigued, then stunned. Because the evidence wasn't pointing toward a scandal. It was pointing toward a misunderstanding so large that entire agencies had missed it. The Cannery's waste issue had been real. The drainage alterations had been real. The flooding impacts had been real. But the extraordinary productivity of Martha's farm belonged to a much older story. A story that began long before the cannery existed, long before the industrial park, long before most people in the room were born. When she finished speaking, nobody laughed, nobody whispered, nobody checked their phones. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then an engineer stood. He reviewed the documents again. Then he said something few people expected. "She's right." Another consultant agreed. Then another. The silence returned. Only this time it felt different. Not uncertainty. Recognition. The truth had finally become undeniable. News coverage exploded. Regional agricultural publications picked up the story. Universities requested access to the data. Soil scientists visited the area. County officials commissioned broader reviews. Farmers started examining historical maps they hadn't touched in years. Questions spread far beyond Martha's property. What other decisions had been forgotten? What other records had disappeared? What other answers were sitting inside old boxes waiting for someone to notice them? The reckoning wasn't dramatic. No handcuffs, no courtroom showdown, no villain standing under bright lights. Reality is rarely that simple. Instead, there were corrections, policy changes, infrastructure projects, record preservation initiatives, updated watershed planning, better coordination between agencies, the kind of improvements that arrive quietly, but matter for decades. The cannery eventually entered agreements supporting restoration efforts. Counties coordinated drainage improvements. Landowners received assistance where impacts could be demonstrated. The process took time, years in some cases, but it moved forward. And through all of it, Martha kept farming. She still woke before sunrise, still checked moisture levels, still kept notebooks, still walked her fields. Visitors continued arriving. Many wanted to see the famous vegetable farm. Others wanted to hear the story. Most expected Martha to talk about the cannery. Instead, she usually talked about observation, about paying attention, about looking twice. Sometimes she'd kneel beside a garden bed and scoop up a handful of soil. Then she'd let it fall through her fingers. You'd be surprised what the ground remembers. People often smiled at that. Some thought it was a joke. Others understood exactly what she meant. Because this had never really been a story about waste, or permits, or drainage channels. It was a story about overlooked information, about assumptions, about what happens when experience and evidence finally meet. Years later, the headlines disappeared. The investigations ended. The meetings stopped. Life moved on, but traces remained. Restored waterways, updated maps, protected records, and fields that drained a little better than before. One evening near the end of harvest season, Martha stood beside the old ditch behind her property, the same ditch that started everything. The water moved steadily through the channel, not fighting the land anymore, following it. The last light of the day settled across the rows of vegetables. Beyond them, frogs called from the reeds. The sound carried across the fields, calm, steady, unhurried. Martha listened for a moment, then turned toward home. Behind her, the water followed the path it had always wanted to take, and the land had been telling the truth the entire time.